So welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us to hear Rosa Brooks speak today about her new book. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future of War project and the Center on the Future of War, which links New America with the university where I teach at, Arizona State University. And Rosa Brooks is part of our Future of War team. So we have a team of over 100 ASU faculty and a team of several dozen DC-based experts. So Rosa is a senior fellow here at New America. She's a columnist for foreign policy. Many of you may know her work from reading that. And she is, of course, a professor at Georgetown University in the law school. She previously worked at the Pentagon as counselor to the Undersecretary of Defense Policy. And as you know, those of you who've read the book or are planning to read the book, a lot of what is so fascinating and engaging about the book are the accounts of Rosa's time working there in the Department of Defense. So Rosa will speak for a bit about the book. Then we'll have a short conversation, and then we'll turn questions over to all of you in the audience. So let's welcome Rosa Brooks.
They've set this podium up solely with this fancy little iPad over here, and I don't know what this does to people like me who actually still use paper notes. There's actually nowhere to put them without them sliding off because all the space is taken up with this fancy technological thing here. So Daniel, thank you for your introduction. It's terrific to be here. New America is one of my homes in DC, and so I'm always very, very happy to talk to people here, and it's good to see some familiar faces in the audience as well. So I will start by telling a story. It's a story that is sort of previewed on the jacket copy in the book, and those of you who read the book may know it. It's a story about when my mother came to visit me at the Pentagon. I should say it was not a completely foregone conclusion that I was going to end up working at the Pentagon or end up being married to an Army officer. I came from a family that was very much on the left. One of my earliest memories is sitting on a picnic blanket in Central Park during the celebration marking the end of the Vietnam War, and I can remember, with my family protesting the resumption of draft registration requirements in 1980 with these homemade banners that I had made carefully with my brother, and we big magic marker stopped the draft and so forth. So it was not completely obvious I was going to end up in the Pentagon. The book talks a little bit about how that comes about. I won't talk about that now, but I mention it only to say that the Pentagon was also not a particularly obvious place for my mother to want to come spend any time as an old anti-war activist. I think her most recent visit to the Pentagon had involved an effort to levitate it in the 1960s. But I had been working there for maybe 6 months, and I said, "Mom, you ought to come and visit me. Let me take you to lunch." And so she took the metro, and she, I get her through security, through the visitor's entrance, and we go up the escalator, and we're walking past the food court, and we're walking past the floral shop and the chocolate shop, which sadly I'm told no longer exists, recently died. But at the time, the chocolate shop was there, and there's a place you can get DVDs for rent. There's a CVS, there's banks, there's a eye doctor, there's a DMV. And at a certain point, my mom stops short in the corridor, and she just stops. And I kind of, "Mom, are you still with me?" And she looks around her and she says, "You're telling me that the heart of American military power is a shopping mall?" Pretty much, right? And she wasn't far wrong. The Pentagon, I think, is still the world's biggest office building. It's got, I found this amazing fact on the visitor tour website. It's got 17.5 miles of corridors. It's got about 23,000 employees, a mix of civilian and military. And over the years, lots of different shops and restaurants have sprung up in its corridors to cater to those 23,000 people who work there. And over time, you could probably say that the US military itself has started to offer a similar kind of one-stop shopping experience to the nation's top policymakers. It's somewhat surreal. At the Pentagon, you can buy a new pair of running shoes, or you can order some Marines to patrol in the Philippines. You can, if you have a headache, you can get some Tylenol at CVS, or you could send a team of Army medics to fight malaria in Chad. You could buy yourself a new cheap cell phone, or if you're sufficiently senior, you could task the National Security Agency with monitoring the cell phone communications of a terror suspect. And until quite recently, although probably somewhere deep in the Pentagon, probably at the souvenir shop, you can still do this, but certainly for many years at the chocolate shop, you could buy a small chocolate sculpture of a fighter jet about this big, or you could order up a drone strike in Yemen. You name it, the Pentagon supplies it. My friend, retired Lieutenant General Dave Barno, once put it to me that the military has essentially become like a super Walmart with everything under one roof. And we've seen 2 successive presidential administrations, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, have been eager consumers. Needless to say, the military's transformation into the world's biggest one-stop shopping operation isn't necessarily cause for celebration. But it's both the product and the driver, I think, of really seismic changes in how we think about war, with some consequent challenges for how we think about our laws, and indeed the rule of law, and for how we think about the military itself. And indeed, one of the issues that the book talks about a bit is that we're trapped in something of a vicious circle, where here's the circle we've gotten into. As we face novel security threats that come from novel quarters, and I'm thinking of things like transnational non-state terrorism, threats from cyberspace, threats that emanate from poverty, repression, climate change, you name it. We've gotten into the habit in the post-9/11 world of viewing all threats through the lens of war, and we ask our military then to take on an ever-expanding range of non-traditional tasks. As more and more things become war, more and more things become military tasks. But as we view more and more things as war, the other thing that happens, this has legal implications. To call something part of war, part of armed conflict, triggers one set of legal rules and puts aside a different set of legal rules. So as we view more and more things through the lens of war, we also pull more and more things into the ambit of the law of war, which has a much greater tolerance for secrecy, for the use of lethal force, for coercion, for actions that don't have external checks and balances than ordinary law. And meanwhile, of course, as we ask the military to take on more and more non-traditional tasks, that means that we have to have higher military budgets. If you have higher military budgets, you have to look for savings somewhere else, so we freeze or cut the budgets of civilian foreign affairs agencies. And as budget cuts cripple those agencies, their own capabilities dwindle. They can do less and less, so we turn to the military to pick up the slack, and the whole cycle continues again. It's the old, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail adage. If your only functioning government institution is the military, then everything looks like a war. And war rules start to look like they should apply to everything. And of course, when everything looks like a war, everything looks like a job for the military. Everything looks like a military mission, which displaces civilian institutions and undermines their credibility, even as they begin to overload the military itself. Lot is at stake here, more, I think, than we necessarily often realize, for the very simple reason that when we look at something as war, we assume the legitimacy of a totally different set of rules. And this is the one and only time today I'm going to quote Shakespeare. I almost never quote Shakespeare, but I'm going to quote Shakespeare because it makes me feel smart. There's a famous passage in Henry V. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility, but when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. And the basic idea is familiar to everybody. We expect, in peacetime, you don't get to go outside and kill the next person who passes by. If you do, we assume the police are going to come. You're going to be arrested. You're going to be charged. You're going to be tried. You're probably going to end up in prison. In wartime, if you're a combatant and you kill an enemy combatant, you might even get a medal. So all the rules are almost flipped in wartime. Not all of them, obviously, but many rules are flipped. And we tolerate in wartime all kinds of things that we would regard as morally reprehensible and unlawful in peacetime. And we do that because we think of war as a temporary and exceptional state of affairs. That you can tolerate behavior in wartime because it's temporary. It doesn't last forever, and it doesn't bleed over into ordinary life. It's necessary for a limited period, and then the necessity ends. We go back to normal morality and normal rules. What happens, of course, when the boundaries around what we consider to be war and the boundaries around what the role of the warrior is begin to blur, is that we lose our ability to figure out, hey, when are these actions appropriate and when are they not? It gets very, very confusing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as in the next few minutes. So for this reason, right, the sort of obvious reason that we tolerate and indeed demand radically different things from warriors in wartime than we want or would tolerate from ordinary people in peacetime, virtually every human society throughout history has tried really hard to draw sharp lines between war and not war. Until less than a century ago, for instance, most Western societies insisted that wars should be formally declared, should take place on clearly delineated battlefields, and be fought by uniformed soldiers who operated within specialized, organized military hierarchies. In different societies in earlier times, humans found other ways to delineate war's boundaries, and I'm thinking of things like rituals involving initiations of warriors and war paint and war magic and war drums and so forth. In Old Norse society, the berserkers, give us our modern word berserk, warriors would don the pelts of wild animals and believe that they would take on those attributes during war. The Navajo in the American Southwest literally had a different language that was spoken by warriors as they embarked on raids. They would leave their own village and they would begin to use a different vocabulary, different verb forms specially designed for war. When they returned from war raids, they would draw a line in the desert sand. They would face enemy territory. They would turn to face their home territory. They would step over the line and resume the ordinary language again. Many Native American groups had war chiefs and peace chiefs. And during wartime, the locus of government authority would literally shift to a completely different person, not only a different set of rules, and then revert back to the peace chief in time of peace. Another example that I love is the Macao Indians in Papua New Guinea, who had very elaborate rituals designed to turn ordinary people into warriors prior to war. And male warriors, as they prepared, they had to go through a period of abstinence, both sexual abstinence and refraining from consuming certain kinds of foods and certain kinds of drinks in order to create the war sorcery that would enable them to prevail in times of conflict. But when they returned from war, they had to do the same thing again. They had to once again be abstinent. They couldn't have sexual relations with their wives for several months, lest the war magic enter both of their bodies and kill them. Literally, war was seen as toxic to ordinary life and human relationships, and you had to take careful measures to protect the community. Essential as war magic was to war itself, you had to find a way to prevent it from leaching over into ordinary life. We're actually not that different, right? It's easy to think of these as sort of exotic little examples from primitive groups, but of course we still have these rituals ourselves, and I'm sure some of you in this audience are in the military, have been in the military. Think back to basic training, think back to the first days for new students at one of our military academies. Your hair is shorn, your clothing is taken away from you and replaced with a different set of clothing. I see a few nods here. You get mystifying little bits of colored fabric to put on your chest that are unintelligible to anyone outside of that particular tribe. You learn a new language. You have to memorize bits of often quite arcane lore that may have no practical value except to be part of initiating you into this particular tribe. How is the cow? For any people at a couple of the academies, some very, very, very odd ones, actually, when you look at them from the outside. And in fact, much like the Old Norse, we too have a tendency to name our weapon systems after our totem animals, hoping that we will take on their characteristics: the hornet, the reaper, the black hawk, the predator. So we're not so different ourselves, right? That we too, this is part of an elaborate ritual and symbolic apparatus that we, the American tribe, has created that helps us think, helps maintain a set of beliefs in which we think of war as distinct from everyday life, as a separate sphere, the exception, not the norm. And we think of war as something that is so distinct it shouldn't intrude into our ordinary world of soccer games and shopping malls and office buildings. And not only is war, we think, an easily recognizable state of exception to normal business. But the military, we think, is an institution that can be easily, if somewhat tautologically, defined by its specialized war-related functions. What is the military? The military is the institution that does war, whatever war may be. The problem, of course, despite this still quite elaborate sort of ritual and symbolic apparatus designed to help us keep war in a box symbolically, is that that's not really tenable anymore, given the nature of today's threats. In a world rife with transnational non-state actors, cyber threats, et cetera, you just can't keep war in a box, and war keeps bursting out of the box. And our traditional categories, war, not war, warrior, civilian, have gotten less and less easy to apply to the point where I think they're becoming almost analytically useless and sometimes counterproductive in terms of the ways in which they confuse us rather than enable us to clarify what is actually happening. And to state the obvious, I think for this audience in particular, in a cyber conflict, for instance, or war on terrorism, there can't be any boundaries in time or in space. You don't have a clear beginning or end, and maybe no possibility of a beginning or end. You can't confine the war to a particular geographical location. You can't say anymore, aha, the war is in France and Germany, but it is not in Switzerland, which is neutral. Then the war goes where the threat goes. The war goes where the threatener goes. And the war crosses boundaries in a flash because the war may be electronic, or maybe in the form of a virus, or maybe in the form of simply a missile that travels faster than humans can track it. We don't know what counts as a weapon anymore either. A hijacked passenger plane, kind of box cutters you can buy at CVS, a line of malignant computer code weapon. We can't even define the enemy. I mean, the United States has been dropping bombs on somebody in Syria for a couple years now, but I think most Americans, and probably even most people in this room, and probably most members of the inner circle of the executive branch would be somewhat hard-pressed to articulate exactly who the enemy is and why they're the enemy and how we know that they are the enemy and not someone else. It's very, very hard to articulate in these perpetually morphing organizations. And we've lost any coherent basis, finally, for distinguishing between combatants and civilians. In a world in which we view threats as emanating from so many different sources, as a Chinese hacker who hacks into US government servers and steals the security clearance information of government employees, is that an act of war? Is that a combatant? What about a financier for Somalia's al-Shabaab, or a Pakistani teenager who spreads extremist recruiting videos on Facebook, or a Russian engineer who's paid by ISIS to maintain captured Syrian oil fields? That those categories have gotten, the categories always had blurriness on the margins, but they've gotten murkier and murkier over the last couple of decades. So let me go back to what's at stake here, right? Lawyers have this fancy term for the law of war. We call it the lex specialis, which is Latin for special law. And we contrast it to the lex generalis, the general law. And the special law, as the name suggests, applies in special circumstances, and the special circumstances war. And the term itself suggests that that is intended to be exceptional. You have ordinary law, general law, most of the time, and then every now and then, when you have a war, you apply the law of war. But the law of war, as I said, allows states and their agents much more latitude to use lethal force, to keep its actions secret, to not have to answer to other branches of government, to use other forms of coercion, surveillance, imprisonment, and so on. Peacetime law is the opposite. Peacetime law emphasizes individual rights. It emphasizes due process. It emphasizes restraints on the use of state power. When we lose the ability to draw any clear line between this is war, this is not, this is where the law of war applies, this is where it doesn't, what happens is that we start losing any principled basis for making some of the most vital decisions a democracy can possibly make. We lose the ability to decide which matters should be subject to judicial review and which don't need to be. Everybody knows that you can't have a court on the battlefield, and if your model is Normandy and the D-Day invasion, You know, you can't have a judge deciding whether you can shoot at that German soldier. It doesn't make any sense to us. In peacetime, of course, we think the opposite. But what about US drone strikes? Where do they fit in here? But if we can't decide if they're wars or not, we don't know how to think about them. If you don't know what a war is, you don't know when it's okay for governments to have secret laws and when that's a terrible offense to democracy. You don't know when the state can monitor its citizens' phone calls or email communications and when it can't. You can't decide who should be in prison for how long, with what degree of due process. And ultimately, you can't decide under what circumstances, where, and against whom lethal force can be used. The one thing that the law of armed conflict, the law of war, is missing is it has no definition of war, leaving us to decide. That's really a political choice, ultimately, what counts as war and what doesn't. And so, and the stakes could not be higher, right? Think of something that's obviously been very controversial, US drone strikes, targeted killings. Sort of doesn't really matter that they're involved, might involve drones, might involve something else, but essentially it's the US deciding to take away the lives of individuals outside of so-called hot battlefields in foreign countries. Well, if the law of war applies, if you can reasonably and if you can coherently argue, as the US government does, that we're in an armed conflict with Al-Qaeda and its associated forces, and that conflict extends to all these various drone strike targets, then there is nothing morally or legally interesting or surprising about them, right? They have their moral status is that we target enemy combatants during an armed conflict, and their moral status is absolutely no different than the American soldier on the beaches at Normandy who shoots at a German who's pointing a machine gun at him. There's nothing new here. On the other hand, if we're not sure this is an armed conflict, or we're not sure that the people we're targeting are combatants, or we're not sure if they're participating in hostilities, well, then they're just murders. Then the US government is going around the world and murdering people in foreign countries. And we really want to know the difference, right? We really want to be on the right side of that particular set of questions. And when we aren't quite sure we have a coherent or principled basis for asserting that it's one or the other, that's not a very good place to be. Needless to say, when we expand what we label war, we also expand, we also lose any, when we sort of blur the boundaries between war and not war, we also blur the boundaries between what's an appropriate task for the military and what's not. We can't decide anymore what should be left to civilians. And so today we have American military personnel in almost every country on Earth. Obviously not in large numbers in most places, but in almost every country on Earth. And they do nearly every job on Earth. In some places, they do exactly what soldiers have done for generations and generations, and they crawl through the mud with heavy loads on their backs, and they get in firefights. In other places, they launch raids, but they also launch agricultural reform projects. They plan airstrikes, and they plan small business development initiatives. They train parliamentarians, and they produce TV soap operas. They patrol for pirates. They monitor global email communications. They design programs to prevent human trafficking in the Pacific. They even vaccinate cows. It's Walmart, right? Years and years ago, when I was a law student, and I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I still don't know. But I applied for a job at McKinsey, the big management consulting company. And during the interview process, they like to give you these sort of hypothetical questions and see if your answers are kind of management consultant-like. And one of the hypotheticals that I remember getting when I interviewed at McKinsey was, okay, imagine that you run this sort of small mom-and-pop grocery store, and business is going great. But then one day, Walmart announces that they're moving and they're opening a store a block away. What do you do? And I said, roll over and die, which was apparently the wrong answer. I think I was supposed to say something like, oh, I will get all artisanal, and I will sell Sikori soy lattes with Aztec spices, and I will carve out my little niche, and everybody will keep coming to my awesome and cool little store, so Walmart won't bother me. But of course, we all know that my answer, although probably not the right interview answer, was probably an accurate answer. When Walmart moves in down the street, the writing is on the wall for all the little mom and pop shops. And like Walmart, today's military can marshal vast resources and exploit economies of scale in a way that would be impossible for smaller mom-and-pop operations. And like Walmart, today's military's expansion and the tempting one-stop shopping convenience that the military has come to offer to policymakers has had a devastating effect on smaller, more traditional enterprises, in this case, the State Department, USAID, and other little mom-and-pop operations, which compared to the size of the military really are kind of mom-and-pop operations. It's often said, I was skeptical about whether it's true, and I checked, and in fact it is true, there are more members of military marching bands than there are foreign service officers in the United States. The Pentagon, the military, isn't necessarily any better at promoting agricultural reform or economic reform or governance reform than the State Department or USAID, and in many cases it may be worse. Not that anybody is particularly good at it, as it turns out. But the big difference between what the military can offer and what the civilian agencies can offer is that unlike our civilian government agencies, the Pentagon has millions of employees at its disposal, willing to work in horrific conditions, willing to work insane hours, and it's basically open 24/7, right? So how should we feel about the Walmartization of the military? You know, I think of Walmart, the store, right? And we all hate Walmart. It's very fashionable. You're not supposed to like Walmart. We all have to say, oh, Walmart, you know, it's so tacky and it's so cheap and the stuff is not good quality. We think it's too big, too ubiquitous. We suspect that there's a lot of human misery at the heart of that enterprise, too. And we prefer not to see it, so we use our zoning laws to exile it with the other big, nasty, big box stores to the sort of commercial hinterlands outside of town where we don't actually have to look at it. But much as we resent Walmart, most of us would be hard-pressed to completely live without. How many people here have been to Walmart? Yeah, you may not like it, but we all end up there eventually, right? There's something that's going to drive you to Walmart sooner or later. And as the US military struggles to define its role, I think it's evoking similarly contradictory emotions in the civilian population. You know, civilian government officials, the White House, wants a military that costs less but does more. A military that will stay deferentially out of strategy discussions but will be always available to ride to the rescue and solve any given problem. We want a military that will prosecute our ever-expanding, metastasizing wars, but that won't ask us to face any of the complicated moral and legal questions that they raise, or that are created by the eroding boundaries between war and peace. We want a military that will solve every global problem anywhere, but the rest of the time will stay safely quarantined on isolated bases, separated from the rest of us by barbed wire fences and anachronistic rituals and acres of cultural misunderstanding. And indeed, I think it's accurate to say, and hardly a new observation, that even as the boundaries around war have blurred, even as the military's activities and sphere of activities have expanded, that the US military itself as a human institution has grown more sharply delineated from the broader society it is charged with protecting. And what this ends up doing is leaving fewer and fewer civilians who have either the knowledge or the confidence to raise questions about how we define war or how the military operates. It's not too late to change this, although I don't think it will be easy. I really want to end talks on a sort of positive, upbeat note and say, and don't worry, all problems can now be solved. And none of these have simple answers. I don't think we can turn back the clock. I don't think this is a simple issue of, well, the military got out of its box, let's put it back, or, well, let's just start applying the law of war in a better way, because I don't think that that is the answer. I think that the world has changed. You know, real things happening in the world create these problems. They're not created by any conspiracy theory or a bunch of bad lawyers or anything like that. You know, that events in the world, we have essentially a binary legal system, a legal system that says there is peace and there is war, and there is one set of rules for peace and there's another set of rules for war, and that's the end of the story. So your only decision is to figure out which of those two boxes to put something in. So it's a binary legal system in a non-binary world, and in a world that has been throwing up more and more challenges that lie in that messy space between war and peace. But I think that the the thing to remember as we think about the rule of law challenges is that the categories that we've created and the institutional and legal rules that accompany those categories, you know, they're not any more sacred or permanent than the rules that the Navajo or the Macao Indians or the berserkers amongst the Old Norse created, right? That every society has tried to distinguish between war and peace, but they've done it in a multitude of different ways. And many societies have opted to have in-between categories as well, that these aren't necessarily the only two categories. You know, that you can have a set of rules for things that aren't quite war but aren't quite peace. And I think for us, you know, as we think about the conundrums, for instance, if we're bothered by the moral and legal ambiguity of targeted killings, to me this is actually not that hard a problem. It represents a failure of imagination more than anything else, that when we look at that in-between space, you know, the fundamental task is never, ever, ever consult the lawyers, because they'll just say, well, is it war, is it peace, because that, you know, then this rule applies and then this doesn't. But instead to say to ourselves, you know, if it doesn't fit neatly into any of the existing legal frameworks, let's instead ask ourselves, you know, what kind of world are we trying to create? You know, what are we trying, what objectives do we have? What are we trying to achieve in terms of security, in terms of stability? And what values do we care about? You know, what world are we trying to shape in terms of the precedents we set and so forth? And to come up with rules that work for that murky in-between category. And I don't think that's actually a particularly impossible task, and I'm happy to talk about it in more specificity on things like targeted strikes if you are interested. And I also think that if we don't like the simultaneous Walmartization and isolation of the US military, we can change how we think about the military's role. And I actually part ways with some of my friends here at New America by thinking that probably it is too late to say, oh, let's just reinvigorate the civilian institutions, and that we might be better off saying, well, if the military is going to be doing all these different kinds of things, let's figure out how to make them good at it. Let's figure out what it would actually take seriously if instead of saying, oh, this is just temporary and aberrational, any second now we're going to get back to funding the State Department fully and USAID is going to get big and we're going to have a new US information agency. If that's not going to happen, what would it take to change our military into an institution that doesn't regard these activities as fundamentally exceptional, but that says we need to figure out how to do them well? How would you change everything from recruiting to training to the personnel system, et cetera? Hard, but not impossible, you know, not beyond our ability to imagine. And I certainly think very few military leaders want to preside over the Walmartization of the military in its current form, right? I think many fear that the military, under pressure to be all things to all people, ends up finding itself able to offer little of enduring value to anyone. And ultimately, I think the fear is, you know, you think of Walmart, it's not so much Walmart on a good day, but the fear is that the military ends up looking like Walmart the day after a Black Friday sale, you know, stripped bare by greedy consumers who want what it has but don't much like it either. With not much left behind, but shoddy merchandise sort of strewn haphazardly around the aisles and some very demoralized employees. And I don't think we want that either. Let me close there, and I would be delighted to get your comments and your questions, and thank you very much.
So, thank you so much, Rosa. First, I want to thank a co-sponsor on the event is Defense One. And for those who are tweeting, it's #FutureOfWar. So the title, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything, Tales from the Pentagon. You did a beautiful job explaining some of the core arguments of the book, which is, you know, destined, I think, to be a classic in this evolving future of war literature. This is you're touching on things that I think you're giving name to things that are.
I didn't know that there was an evolving future of war literature.
Well, now that there is, and we have an evolving, a beginning of some key texts, right? So one thing that you spoke about simultaneously, both the Walmartization of the military at the same time as recognizing a sort of civilian-military divide where smaller numbers of Americans are involved in the military. I'm curious, we just have passed the 15-year anniversary of 9/11, which suggests, you know, a decade and a half of the country at war in some formal sense, or at least a sense that's widely presented that way by politicians. So To what degree do you think that this, how war became everything, has bled over into express civilian spaces, such as law enforcement or such as conceptions of social order or any of these issues?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think it does. I have a little short section in the book on what I call trickle-down war, the ways in which the rituals, habits, practices, and increasingly legal rules designed for war are kind of leaching over into ordinary law and ordinary life. And I think you can certainly see it in some of the ways, for instance, that our immigration and refugee system has really shifted to a security-oriented system from a service-oriented system. I think you can see it to some extent in not only the sort of equipment, but policing tactics, and you can trace the increased use of sort of paramilitary-style SWAT teams, which were initially conceptualized as being there for the rare occasional crisis, such as hostage rescue situation or a terrorist attack, but have increasingly in many cities begun to be used in serving high-risk warrants, for instance, and more sort of routinized policing, taking that form. And I think most difficult to track, but in some ways most worryingly to me, you can see a kind of a migration of rules created for the exceptional national security case, e.g. rules that in litigation would permit secret hearings or hearings where only one party is involved, that were designed for national security litigation, that have begun to sort of be normalized and bleed over into litigation on sort of ordinary, good old-fashioned crime, or ordinary criminals. I don't want to totally bore everybody to tears, but yeah, I mean, for instance, the use of the State Secrets Act. I have a colleague at Georgetown who's done some really fascinating work on this, Laura Donahue. The state secrets privilege allows the government to judicially create a privilege. It allows the government to say to the court, essentially, hey, this evidence should be suppressed, or maybe even this entire lawsuit should be dismissed because there's no way for it to go forward without exposing, critical, sensitive national security information. And the idea, of course, is that this would be invoked only in cases that involve national security matters. But one of the things that Laura Donahue has documented that's really fascinating and disturbing is that as the private security apparatus has grown, so e.g. you have deals between, say, telecom companies and the NSA, the number of Americans whose work in some way or another touches national security has grown dramatically, to the point where we're increasingly seeing the state secrets doctrine invoked in litigation that has nothing to do on its face with national security. So for instance, say you're mad at AT&T, you have a dispute with them as a customer, just your cell phone's not working right, and you end up going to court with them. And AT&T thinks, oh, we don't want to have to defend this pesky lawsuit against that Daniel lawyer. He's too good of a lawyer. We don't want to have to pay out a big payout. And so they think, we have these relationships with the National Security Agency, and we could say that in the form of sort of soft blackmail, we could say to the NSA, oh, gee, NSA, we're kind of concerned that if we have to go forward in this litigation against Daniel, we might have to reveal some aspects of our relationship with you. So we would like you to ask the court to suppress this piece of evidence or to throw out the litigation. And so in a sort of indirect way, we end up seeing the state secrets doctrine invoked in private litigation on matters that in and of themselves have nothing to do with national security. As sort of war's tentacles reach more things become vulnerable to that. So that's one example. And she's done a really fascinating job of sort of documenting the kind of creeping of the state secrets doctrine into private litigation.
So then to zoom out a little bit, you said that the classic war peace boxes and delineations and categories have become analytically useless, and specifically that they have hurt a principled basis for judgment.
Yeah.
And a lot of the book talks about these different kinds of categories. So I'm wondering if you have any guidance on the issue of categories and language. If war and peace is troubling, if combatant, non-combatant is troubling, are there ways in which we can gain some foothold on moving forward through shifts in language and terminology?
Yeah. I mean, I think we need a new language in a sense. We need a new language that fits that in-between space, and we're going to have to create one. I have this, Daniel, you've probably seen me do this, and the book has one illustration, and it's an illustration of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's famous sketch of the duck rabbit, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you know those optical illusions where you see something you can't figure out, is this a vase or is this two women's profiles looking at each other? And it's a little simple drawing of something that you look at it and it looks like it's a duck, then you look at it again and you think, oh no, wait, those are ears and that's a rabbit. And of course, the point of the sort of philosophical and linguistic point of the illustration was to say, there are things, the essence of which simply can't be captured by our linguistic categories because, you know, they're not one thing or the other. Or they're both, or you could say they're both, or you could say they're neither, but either way, you can argue until you're blue in the face about, is it a duck, is it a rabbit, is it a vase, is it two women's faces, and there's not an answer. There's no answer that is dictated by language or rules, that the only possible answer will be you make a choice. You can choose which to see, you know, how to see it, and that may be informed by the context and so forth, and I think that we are at a point with our categories of combatant, civilian, armed conflict, not armed conflict, where when we look at something like a particular drone strike, our decision to decide that we're going to consider it part of war or not is just as impossible. You know, that there's nothing the law can offer us that will help us make that decision. You know, is it a duck, is it a rabbit, is it a combatant, is it a civilian? Well, you know, both, neither, we don't know. And when you get to that, well, but it doesn't, right? I mean, that's the trap we fall into. We fall into the trap of thinking that our categories are universal, you know, that these categories that were handed down by God or something, right? And they're not. You know, we made them up. The law of armed conflict is of recent vintage. You know, it was created within the last 150 years and elaborated within the last 70 years. We created it to achieve certain normative purposes. We created it because we thought it would be a useful set of categories and rules to get us to a place where we wanted to be. We can change it again. You know, that we get stuck in imagining that these frameworks somehow are magic or sacred, and they really aren't. And I think that that's the sort of, it's a massive failure of sort of legal and political imagination in this country since 9/11 to be unable to break free of this particular and perfectly arbitrary framework of laws and institutions.
So technically, under U.S. law and the Constitution and subsequent laws, there's a mechanism through which war is meant to should be declared and processed, and yet it's interesting that despite the clarity of those mechanisms and the language, that isn't actually how the projection of force has operated. Right. So is that an example that operates in the in-between, or is that a failure? Is that a success within a system that's non-functional? How would you see that?
I think that's that in particular example of a dysfunctional Congress, which is dysfunctional in many other respects as well, not just that one, obviously. But yeah, I mean, Congress has manifestly lost all interest in any meaningful oversight of the process of deciding when force can be used. And I think we see that in the debates about the authorization to use military force and how much can you sort of shoehorn into the 2001 authorization. Everything, it turns out, if you're the White House. Nothing, it turns out, if you're critics on the left. Some things, but not others, if you're, you know, in between. But I mean, I think that it illustrates both the brokenness of our categories. When you can take a short, simple, direct piece of law that was clearly designed to be restrictive and argue it, in fact, it is not restrictive at all, that's certainly an illustration of the sort of brokenness of law, but it's also an illustration of just a failure of political will.
Would you at all see it as the sort of rabbit and duck story, and that, you know, the actions continue possibly identical with adhering to the law?
But let's.
So what's the problem?
Let's describe things in ways that have some specificity in terms of what's happening, and that enable us to decide if we want them to happen or not. Right? That we have a legal framework that ends up being obfuscating, and I think, and to me, actually, one of the most disturbing, and in some ways, to me, shocking, as a citizen, shocking things that has happened since 9/11 has been the degree to which larger and larger swathes of US foreign policy, and indeed an entire war, have vanished into the covert world. You can think that the Iraq War was a good idea or a bad idea, but we all knew it was happening. George Bush didn't deny it. He didn't say, I didn't see any Iraq War. You know, it was crystal, you could love it or hate it. We all knew it was happening. Love it or hate it, you knew that the Vietnam War was happening. Love it or hate it, you knew that the US was invading Afghanistan, using military force in Afghanistan. When it comes to targeted killings, for instance, the US government has yet to acknowledge more than a tiny fraction formally. So even though it's one of the worst kept secrets in the world, we know that, you know, maybe an estimated 4,000 or so people have been killed. Obviously, those estimates have to be based on journalistic accounts, NGO accounts, and so forth, because officially speaking, the US government neither confirms nor denies that any of these strikes have actually taken place. But that's kind of shocking to have the use of lethal force in a democracy on a scale that is not trivial. You know, several thousand dead bodies is not a trivial number of dead bodies. It's not accidental or incidental or on the margins. And it's gone on for years, and yet officially it does not exist. And I think that when you have one of the things, as I mentioned just briefly in passing, that when you decide to put something in the war box, we tolerate a degree of secrecy. We say, oh, you know, of course you can't tell everybody your operational plans and da-da-da-da-da-da, and you have to have, you know, we tolerate secrecy, and we tolerate a lack of checks and balances. You know, of course you can't have the court on the beaches of Normandy, you know. And then those analogies get extended to situations where they don't make any sense. You know, could you have a court potentially deciding on targeted strikes? Well, the argument for why you can't is because it would be crazy and bullets are flying all over the place and you don't have any time and people have to make split-second decisions. And the enemy's wearing a uniform too, so it's really easy to tell that he's the enemy. None of that actually applies in any meaningful way when we talk about most targeted strikes, where the target is known, generally speaking, weeks, months, sometimes years in advance. And we have elaborate dossiers on that person. And they're very far away and pose no immediate threat. So the actual logic behind the rules gets completely lost because we do this sort of linguistic magic act and we call it war, and then we say, aha, it doesn't need all that due process stuff and it doesn't need to be transparent, it can be secret and so forth. And it covers up situations that if we were able to look at them without the sort of blurring lens of these legal frameworks, we might be able to say, oh wait, yeah, this doesn't look like ordinary crime, but it doesn't quite look like traditional war either. Let's figure out, you know, what do we care about when it comes to the use of force by our government? Maybe we care that it's exercised responsibly. Maybe we want a court to be involved. Maybe we don't care about that, but we want, you know, some other accountability mechanism. You know, maybe we want compensation to be paid if there are mistakes or to relatives. Maybe we don't. But whatever it is, we can't have that discussion if it's behind this cloak of, we put it in the war box and now you can't see it, it's a secret, go away.
So before we open to questions from the audience, is that the element of this tension that most frightens you about this blurring of distinctions? The secrecy, covert?
Yeah, the degree to which it enables us, it enables our government to not tell us, and it enables most of us to not see what we're doing, what we're asking our military to do, the risks we're asking them to take, and the risks that we're imposing on others. It blinds us to the precedents that we're setting in legal terms internationally, and it's a whole other topic. But it blinds us to the ways in which our actions may be in fact undermining other legal frameworks that we rely on to help ensure international stability. So it blinds us to both our own sort of collective actions and to their consequences in ways that I think are both devastating for any country that calls itself a democracy. At a bare minimum, you know, the idea you have to, you know, have some notion of what your government is doing, so you can decide if it's something maybe it's something maybe it's something we want to do, which is fine, right? We make decisions based, we find out what's going on, we say, yeah, good idea, do it this way, not that way. But you can't have that conversation at all, and that is very frightening to me.
So on this point, devastating to any country that calls itself a democracy, let's open up to questions. So there's a mic that will go around. Please, when you present a question, identify yourself and try to be relatively coherent and short. So right up at the front.
Thank you. I'm Juliana Pilan with the Alexander Hamilton Institute. I'll say amen. This is very useful, and just to add on the last point, another troubling thing regarding the drones is the lack of intelligence that we get from the people whom we kill rather than detain. I am concerned about a little bit about your using Walmart as the example for the very obvious reason that the DoD does not give the cheapest value for its money. And not only that, but arguably they're not trained to do some of the things that civilians do. Very specifically, if you want to focus on one example, the Stabilization and Reconstruction enterprise. The State Department is supposed to be in charge of it and so forth. That is, and yet it hasn't quite done it. To what extent is it rather the problems that the civilian realm, and there's no comparison with the mom and pop shops here, the DOS is not little guy, but to what extent is it not just the lack of enough money for enough people, but actual training and mindset in the civilian sector that is a problem? And you may use the Stabilization and Reconstruction issue as an example if you wish.
Yeah, certainly fair enough to say the DoD is certainly not always the cheapest. I know we've had lots of examples of waste and fraud in the DoD budget. That said, I think when you're looking at sort of mass scale activities, for instance in humanitarian assistance, disasters, earthquakes, et cetera, that's when you see the economies of scale get put to work. You know, that you've got stuff, you've got people, you can get it from place A to place B much more quickly and much more cheaply than any other actor could at that point. I do think that, I think that on the one hand, I wouldn't argue with you and say that the US military has any particular expertise when it comes to post-conflict reconstruction activities. That said, I would caution against us having this sort of nostalgic idea, oh, back in the good old days, the State Department could do all these things, USA could do all these things. Nobody's ever been very good at it. NGOs haven't been good at it, the World Bank hasn't been good at it, the civilian, no, everybody's bad at it because it's hard. That said, you can be kind of ordinarily bad at it, or you can be particularly bad at it because you don't know anything. And I think it is certainly fair to say that in the last 15 years in particular, we have often thrust military personnel into a situation where they have absolutely no training and said, okay, just train these people, or fix this town sewer system, or fix the agricultural economy, and people kind of go, I don't know how to do that. I do think, the State Department is tiny in comparison. It's microscopic in comparison, and even the U.S. military is tiny relative to the potential problems we could choose to throw it at. And part of the fundamental problem right now, the sort of big identity crisis facing our military, is if you think, gee, the next scary threat, the next 9/11 could come from anywhere on Earth, then you need to be thinking about acting and being engaged everywhere on Earth, if nothing else for the sort of shaping the battle space, as we say, and building relationships and gathering information and creating partnerships and so forth. And that's impossible even for an institution as large as the military, much less for an institution as relatively small as our civilian agencies. I think if we wanted our military to be better at many of the tasks we're asking it to do, we would have to really radically rethink everything about it in ways that would be really disruptive institutionally. And I got myself into hot water a few years back by writing a partly tongue-in-cheek article, but not totally joking, in which I said the military ought to stop recruiting in American high schools and start recruiting senior citizens at the annual AARP conference. And everybody said, that's ridiculous, you know. But I wasn't totally joking, because if you think that we're in a situation where most military personnel most of the time will end up doing things like governance reform and so forth, or economic reform, well, if you think that what most military personnel will end up doing is getting into firefights and going on long marches with heavy loads, then you absolutely want to recruit 18-year-old boys. They are strong, they have a lot of stamina. If you think they're going to be doing governance reform, your average 18-year-old boy is not your sort of target demographic, right? You're gonna really change how you think about, well, who do we need? Under what circumstances do we want to have easier routes in and out of the military for people to go back and forth between military roles and civilian agencies or universities or private companies? And that would be a massive rethinking, because we still recruit in basically the same way the military's recruited for the past couple hundred years, right? And that's not, and the problem, of course, for the military is that it still does need to be prepared to do the firefights and the slogging through the mud, right? So trying to do all these things and be ready for all these things at the same time. So I don't think it would be impossible to reimagine the military in a way that would make it better at some of these tasks, although I also think that the broad conceptual problem facing everybody is that there's no institution that can be everywhere and do everything. It's not possible. And the services right now are really wrestling with that question of, if threats could come from anywhere but we can't be everywhere, which set of competencies do we focus on? How do we do it? I don't think anybody knows the answer.
Sorry, in the gray suit, right in the third row.
Hi, Rob Levinson, Bloomberg Government. I have a parlor game that I play in Northern Virginia that makes me very unpopular. I ask people at a dinner party how many people we've lost in Afghanistan and Iraq. Very rarely do I get an answer, anything approaching a correct number. And when I do, then I ask, name one. And I never have had an answer to that question. And you mentioned this, the disconnect between the military and in the last 15 years, we've paid no war tax, we have no draft. The American people are largely very removed from these activities, part because of secrecy, part because our military is smaller, our grandfathers didn't serve, or things like this. Things have changed. How much of that disconnect has contributed to sort of letting the military or this erosion that you talk about, this blurring of the line? Like you say, there's sort of a contradiction here. On the one hand, the military is expanding. On the other hand, the American people are less and less engaged every day with what it's actually doing.
Yeah, so I also think that the disconnect, which is very real, is also exacerbated by the fact that our wars don't kill as many of our service members as they used to. The answer to the question about how many people have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan is what, 7,500, something around that? It does change from month to month, but it's, we lost more people in single-day battles in other wars than we've lost in 15 years in 2 wars, and that's partly because of advances in military medicine, it's partly because of technological advances in armor, and it's partly because we fight in different ways. War has changed again, but that too makes it more, it enables everybody else to not worry about it that much. Oh, not that many people got killed, so it's sad for them and their families, but it's not the kind of mass decimation of entire generations that we saw in the Civil War, for instance, where you really are losing a generation of young men. I do think that the relative isolation of the civilian population from the military community is part of what has enabled all the dynamics that we've been discussing. On the one hand, I think just as we sort of have a tendency to imagine that there was once this golden age of the civilian agencies, that we also sort of think ironically, our golden age of civil-military relations in people's minds is often World War II, and we have this band of brothers fantasy of back in the good old days when everybody was drafted, everybody understood the military, and everybody was connected to it, and of course, there was the whole inconvenience of the war part, which was not so great, but and we have this whole elaborate set of narratives that we tell ourselves about that, and we say, yes, and the Iowa farm boy and the Texas cowboy and the Italian kid from Brooklyn all were thrown together, and they learned to love each other, and they learned they were all Americans, and wasn't that great? And there's truth to that, but what we forget, of course, is that for most of American history, we've had a tiny and professionalized military that was completely disconnected from the rest of the population. You know, not a lot of the military was minuscule, you know, in 1902, 1873, you know, it was off fighting Indian wars and nobody paid any attention to it, essentially, right? So there's nothing new about having only a tiny professionalized volunteer military. And there's nothing inherently bad about that either. You know, that people who aren't lawyers don't know what lawyers do. You know, people who aren't surgeons don't really understand what surgeons do. That it's a profession like any other, and we don't all have to be part of it. I think the reason it's become a problem in a different way than in the past precisely has to do with the expanding range of tasks we're asking it to take on. You know, when the military was operating in a relatively narrow lane, you could say, okay, you know, you have a specialized institution that does this particular kind of dangerous and risky work. We have other specialized institutions and professions that people engage in other kinds of risky and dangerous work, and that's the way it goes. But as we begin to look to the military to be our one and only functioning part of government and one and only functioning foreign policy tool increasingly, that's when that disconnect becomes a problem.
Back with the suit, like, sorry, there we go, thank you.
Hi, Rosa. Matt Gobush. I write for Providence. It's a new journal on ethics and U.S. foreign policy. And my question, you touch upon this in the book, but what role do you think that morality and ethics might play in helping shape or inform the regulation of that space between that you talk about? It seems to me that there's an opportunity, perhaps, as we are rethinking how to manage this new reality, that we could perhaps revisit some of those sort of historical roots or some of the moral foundation of our military.
Thanks, Matt. No, I think morality has to play a big role, and I say this against interest because my day job is I get paid to teach young people to think about the law and to apply the law, and I get paid to tell them, no, the issue here is not whether you think this is good or bad. The issue is whether it is lawful or not lawful given this set of rules. But I think that when it comes to the issues we've been talking about, lawyers have had much too central a role, and that our fascination with the discussion of, well, yes, but is it lawful? Is that drone strike lawful? Is Guantanamo's indefinite detention lawful? Then we kind of go down a rabbit hole of go down the duck rabbit hole, I should say. And as I said, there's sort of no way out. You just end up going around in circles, and you can argue that anything is lawful. But then at some point you say, wait a second, that question seems like the least important question to ask. When you have the U.S. government and it's killed, some 4,000, 5,000 people, there are other questions than just whether you can say it's lawful, which I think you can. Yeah, I think you can. You could say it's not lawful too. But there are other more important questions which have to do with, in addition to questions of morality, they're just obviously strategic questions. They're questions about, is this getting us where we want to go? Is this reducing the threat of extremism, or is it maybe making things worse? And the oh, it's legal answer often blinds us to those questions as well. But I also think, of course, yeah, you at some point you have to say, maybe we could do this legally, but should we? How do we feel about a situation in which the U.S. government can lawfully secretly kill several thousand people in countries around the world without acknowledging it? I don't feel that great about that, and it doesn't make me feel better to say it's legal. It just makes me think, okay, then our legal framework is not achieving our goals of ensuring democratic accountability and ensuring protection of basic rights anymore. Let's change the legal rules because they're not doing their work anymore. So yeah, absolutely. I think as we think about that space between, morality needs to be a vital touchstone.
Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, and also a friend and colleague of your father, as I told you before, from Psychologists for Social Responsibility. So first of all, thank you very much for writing this book. It's important, and I hope it has an effect. And I've been thinking about these issues for decades, and also even within the military. And we spoke at the Future of War conference, and I suggested that we have a conference on the future of preventing war and analyzing and transforming the underlying conflicts. So there are huge bodies of knowledge and work on reversing cycles of violence that aren't even on the radar screen. And there are strategies that we know to do this, and we deal primarily with symptoms and not the underlying causes. And I don't mean what we call root causes like poverty. I don't mean that, it's very simplistic, our understanding of it. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that, and I dropped my membership to ARP, but I'm available for recruitment. Anyway, so.
Okay. Over here in the corner.
Ed Berger. Several years ago, James Carroll wrote a very large tome called The House of War. And the thesis of that book, his father was a general grade officer in the DOD at that point. His view was that the animating principle that led the defense establishment to do what it did was the impetus of procurement. This was, in a sense, an elaboration of the Eisenhower's last speech. Do you think there's anything to that?
I do, although I think today it's less the military-industrial complex than just the sort of broader military security complex. And I do think that those, bureaucracies become self-sustaining and they start serving themselves, and you create an elaborate private sector industry that provides everything from translators to guards to intelligence analysis to computer system support that is connected to this ever-expanding, very blurry war. And then you've got a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on it, and a lot of people whose every day-to-day incentive involves sustaining it and expanding it still further. So I certainly think that that phenomenon, although it's morphed a little because of changing technologies, very much still exists, and it's very hard to unwind those things once they're created.
Hi, my name is Tara McKelvey. I work for the BBC. Hi. Rosa. Tell us a little bit, if you could. I wanted to ask about the lawyer question. I heard CIA Director John Brennan say yesterday that at the White House in the Situation Room, he'd look around and he'd see he'd be the only non-lawyer there. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more about what it's like in the government, how legalistic these decisions have become under Obama, and what that means for us understanding it.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything super concrete that I can add to what you already know, and I know you've worked on this question a lot, but yeah, I think everybody's sometimes their first question and sometimes their only question is that legal, and that's strikes me as often one of the least important questions in this area, because the legal categories are so ambiguous that I can give you any answer you want. And I've sat in many rooms full of really smart lawyers from both inside the government and outside the government, and a million little Chatham House rules round tables on law and war and so forth, and seen these really smart people just get completely tied up in knots, because when you're dealing with just basically category disputes, there's nowhere to go. That it's the duck rabbit problem. It's the equivalent of everybody sitting around and arguing about whether it's a duck or a rabbit. And if you're arguing about whether it's hunting season is open and it's lawful to shoot ducks, that whole discussion is irrelevant if you can't agree on whether you have a duck at all. So I will answer with that mysterious Wittgensteinian reference.
In the back, dark hair in the center.
Hi, my name is Shabnam Mojtahedi with the Syria Justice and Accountability Center. Thank you so much for your comments, very insightful. You spoke a lot about the trickle down domestically. I was wondering if you could speak to the trickle down internationally with some of our partners in the war on terror and how that has impacted the erosion of the rule of law abroad.
Yeah, I think we see it in two dimensions, one of which is the impact on international law itself and international norms, and the other of which is the trickle down in various other countries. And I think we're seeing both. I think in terms of international law and norms, that one of the things that I didn't talk about today, but talk about a fair amount in the book itself, which I know you're all going to go buy and give to your friends for Christmas and stuff. Makes a great gift. Is the erosion of norms about sovereignty and erosion of traditional norms about jus ad bellum rules about when you can use force in another state and against another state. And I do think that the legal theories articulated by the United States post 9/11, first by the Bush administration, but embraced by the Obama administration as well, essentially enable unilateral use of force, whether for humanitarian purposes or when we decide that another state is unwilling or unable to take appropriate action to address a potential terrorist threat, that we get to use force without having to go to the Security Council or any other boring thing like that. And that's dangerous. I understand all the reasons it's come about, and I don't think you can sort of turn back the clock on that either. But as we chip away at norms about sovereignty and the use of force, there's nothing to replace them with yet. And I think it was inevitable that the nature of the world would call those norms further and further into question. But we are continuing to chip away at them, heedless of the heedless of the precedents we set for other actors acting in bad faith, whether it's Vladimir Putin or somebody else. And I think that we have already begun to see several situations in which Russia in particular has essentially flaunted its own arguable breaches of sovereignty and sort of said, United States, you paved the way, thank you. And that's a problem. I think we've also seen it, and a number of human rights groups have documented this really well, the ways in which surveillance, indefinite detention, and so on, the legal theories articulated to justify those in the context of the US counterterrorism are being used by repressive regimes all over the world to spy upon or imprison essentially political dissidents or politically inconvenient groups, but using the same kinds of justifications. So I absolutely think we see it trickling down on that level as well.
In the middle, you've been patient with a blue striped tie.
Hi, my name is Zach Wolfeld. I'm a graduate student at Syracuse University. Thank you for talking today. The question I have is regarding the role of private military contractors involved in military operations. So as the role the military plays expands, and I think contractors play a role in increasing the military's capacity to do different and more varied things. Given that those are not government actors but private entities, how does, regarding the rethinking of the laws of war and whatnot, how does their seemingly increasing participation affect how our government should go about actually thinking about pursuing war or peace or somewhere in the middle when there are so many non-governmental actors involved?
Impossible, hard question to answer, right? Because it's a big topic. But the one thing I would say that worries me, the U.S.'s use of contractors and civilian employees, particularly in the intelligence community, to be involved in the types of lethal force activities that we would traditionally have thought of as military activities is blurring the line sort of from the other side in a way that sort of further makes it hard to apply the law of armed conflict in a useful way. But I also think that just as we have we, the United States, have argued that we can lawfully target people who otherwise look like civilians because we argue that they are participating in hostilities even though they may not carry a weapon or be a card-carrying member of an organization, that we're actually exposing our own, both civilian contractors and civilian intelligence agency employees. We are rendering them targetable as unprivileged combatants as well when we involve them in military activities, that there's no reason another state couldn't say, hey, you know, those guys are unprivileged combatants just like the guys you have at Guantanamo.
Right up front. In the middle.
So Jenna Benihuna, Women's Foreign Policy Network. Thanks, this is really fascinating, and I feel like personally vindicates a lot of my own personal frustrations, so thank you for that. One of the questions I had, and just something that I've seen in my own career, is to your comment about AARP, that seems to me to be alive and well on the kind of rotating, kind of revolving door of folks retiring from the military on a Friday, getting a suit at Macy's over the weekend, and showing up on Monday as a part of the civilian part of the DoD apparatus. I mean, this to me seems to be kind of one way in which the military becomes even more militarized, like that civilian control of the military is illusory in many regards, and that stopgaps to kind of prevent that transition from happening to the really mind-boggling extent that it does, it just doesn't seem to really be there. Do you perceive this? I don't know if you get to this in the book, but it's something I feel like people talk about.
I'm going to say something heretical and say that I'm not all that interested in civilian control of the military as we currently conceptualize it for some of the reasons I've already articulated. And I think these categories are completely arbitrary. You know, we create them to achieve certain normative goals, and we should cherish them to the extent and only to the extent that they actually do in fact further goals that are important to us. And I think the more important question is to say, why would we care about civilian control of the military? It's not because we have some abstract commitment to thinking that people in uniform should answer to people who don't wear uniform. It can't be that, right? That's not what's important. We care about it because for many years it was a mechanism to place constraints on power, essentially. It was a mechanism for saying that those who possess enormous power to kill and to coerce, that we need to have checks and balances to prevent abuses by those who control the tools of power. In today's world, when the tools of lethality and power have themselves been democratized by technological changes and is much more diffuse and decentralized, when what the military does no longer solely has to do with the use of lethal force, I'm not sure what that sort of formal concept of civilian control of the military is doing anymore. I'm not sure that it is actually achieving any of those normative goals anymore. And so I'm much less interested in whether somebody takes off one uniform and puts on another, the uniform of the civilian, than I am in whether in a meaningful, actual sense we have open discussion, public accountability, checks and balances on the many forms of power that can be employed today. That's what's interesting to me, not so much the sort of formal roles. So I would be perfectly happy to have every member of the State Department be former military if they had the right skills and if we had the right accountability mechanisms. So I know that's somewhat heretical, but I think we get way too fixated on the wrong things. We get fixated on the sort of ritual markers of difference rather than on the kind of underlying problem that we created those markers to try to address.
So we have time for one last question, right in the center, left center.
Thank you. My name's Pete Shutley. I had 6 years in the Army and then a whole career in the State Department, Foreign Service Officer. So my question to you is, how do we get out of this vicious circle that you described? I mean, I've seen it close up where a problem arises, Congress wants to address it, the Pentagon's got the money, they've got the stature on the Hill, the Congress throws money at them, the civilian agencies are starved, they can't perform their job, so once again back to the military. And I think I would argue strongly that the vast majority of Americans have no idea about the amount of money in the Pentagon. I mean, it's more than $1 billion a day on, and I could give you dozens of stories of where they spend money. So my question is, how do we get out of this vicious circle?
I hate to say it, but I'm not convinced that we can. You know, and here too, I mean, this is also a little heretical, and I'm a little ambivalent about what I'm about to say. But you know, for years I was one of the many people who ran around saying, we need to rebalance, you know, we need to rebalance and move resources, authorities back into the civilian sector. And at a certain point, I found myself, you know, hearing myself say this for the umpteenth time and watching everybody around me kind of go like, oh, yes, we must. And thinking, it's not happening. It's not happening, and it continues to not happen, it continues to not happen. And I started asking everybody I knew, you know, do you think there's any likelihood whatsoever that in our lifetimes this will change? You know, one day Congress wakes up and says, whoops, you know, how could we have done that? You know, we need to quadruple the foreign affairs budget, and we need to, you know, and everybody sort of says, there is zero likelihood, which then brings me, you know, this relates to the question about civilian control of the military too. Then at some point, it's the sort of waiting for Godot issue. You know, we're all kind of, you know, when is the military gonna get better at all this non-traditional stuff? Well, we don't have to, because we're waiting for the civilian agencies to be, you know, re-empowered, and then we won't have to anymore. And the civilian agency, well, you know, we're just waiting for resources and money to come back to us so that we can assume our rightful place. But if that's not going to happen, you know, if Godot is never going to show up, at what point should we say, okay, for better or for worse, we live in a world in which the military is being asked to take on these tasks and is going to continue to be asked to take them on for the foreseeable future, and nobody's going to show up and shower resources on the State Department and USAID. So let's instead focus on making the military better at doing it, better in the sense of more effective, better in the sense of more transparent, better in the sense of more accountable. That's got some costs, and there's a whole different set of debates about things like neutrality and humanitarian space. But I do think at this stage, you know, again, on some levels, I don't care who does what. I want us as a nation to do what we need to do as a nation, and it's not that important to me whether the people doing it are wearing a uniform or not, or used to wear a uniform or not, or never wore a uniform or not. I just want to make sure that somebody's doing it and doing it well. And that's a whole different conversation, the conversation about what would it mean if we took seriously the idea that we do want our military to do this stuff indefinitely, but to do it better, you know, and that gets you into those conversations about recruiting and training and the personnel system structure and everything else. And I sort of have reached the point where I think that's probably the conversation we ought to be having, not the conversation about how to get back to something that is probably irretrievably gone.
So thank you all so much. Thank you, Rosa. For those who have books, Rosa will be signing books just outside at the entrance. And thank you again.
Somebody's selling books somewhere?
Yeah.
Oh, how about that?
So.